Hello everyone, Dr. Alex Vasquez here to introduce the topic of cardio nutrition, and today will be number 1 in this series, focusing on kidney stones and the ketogenic diet. But first, we're going to talk about some problems that have been published lately, especially related to cardiology and cardiovascular nutrition. Recent publications in JAMA, JAMA Cardiology, and Journal of the American College of Cardiology have created confusion among clinicians due to poor methodology and blatant misrepresentation of data. So the organizations that publish these journals are largely funded by drug companies and drug sales, and as such, they are highly biased in favor of drugs while also being desirous of publishing news that makes the competition, such as nutrition, look mysterious, inefficacious, and of course, dangerous. Basically, what we see here is the exploitation and perpetuation of ignorance on the topic of nutrition among medical physicians. Ultimately, what this creates is an echo chamber of pro-pharma propaganda. Major media outlets such as magazines, newspapers, and television are likewise favorable toward their multi-million-dollar drug company advertisers. And as such, they are quick to pick up pro-pharma news from biased journals and then disseminate this quote-unquote news, which at this point simply becomes advertising propaganda via headlines and major stories, again, in newspapers, magazines, and television. So the solution to this problem, at least in part, is education, and so for this reason I'm going to start this video and review series on the topic specifically of cardio nutrition. Major considerations in cardio nutrition are the same as those in clinical considerations of cardiology and clinical cardiology, and that is we focus on the myocardium, coronary arteries, electroconduction, systemic contributions and complications, and of course that especially means renal considerations. Appreciating the importance of this conversation requires an appreciation of, number 1, the lack of nutrition training in medical school and residency, and number 2, the exploitation of this systematic ignorance by medical societies, journals, drug companies, and the processed food industry to keep doctors busy and thereby turn their haste and confusion into indifference. If you think nutritional ignorance among physicians is a quote-unquote problem, then in my opinion you really don't understand the situation. Systematic and perpetuated problems always serve the dominant power structure, and these are interests generally other than yours and mine, and generally opposite to yours and mine. I've talked about some of these problems recently in some recent video reviews, which you can see at ichnfm.org/18. Those are the PDF transcripts and the videos for 2018. Previously, I looked at this article, Associations of Omega-3 Fatty Acid Supplement Use with Cardiovascular Disease Risks. I noted several problems with this article, including unjustified selective exclusion of data, inclusion of studies that employed subtherapeutic or non-therapeutic dosing. Again, this article really took underdosing to the extreme and completely ignored the omega-3 index, which has been established and validated now for more than 10 years. 9 of the 10 studies used in this meta-analysis use the synthetic ester form of N3 fatty acids. This is in contrast to the natural and easier to digest triglyceride form. The stated conclusion was at odds with the data that was presented, and the pro-pharma conflicts of interest among the authors and the publishing organization are also worthy of note. Then they basically recycled their own information. In this case, I'm speaking of the JAMA journals, and in JAMA they published this kind of commentary, which was basically unnecessary, another nail in the coffin for fish oil supplements. So basically what they did here is they just recycled their own bad information in another journal and then republished it as if it were something new, when number 1, it had already been published, and number 2, it really shouldn't have been published in the first place. The data and conclusions in the first meta-analysis really were not worthy of publication. I also talked a little bit about my own publication experience with JAMA, and that is publishing this letter back in 2004, where they basically eviscerated the article that I wrote and replaced it with one that was inefficacious in pointing out some of the errors in their previously published information. The result of all this is that the science was obscured, and this helped to maintain pharmaceutical dominance. So, as I've said before, these so-called mainstream medical journals love to publish articles showing that nutrition doesn't work or that nutrition is dangerous, or even just publishing doubt. Doubt is enough to discourage people from being interested in the topic and discourage them from looking into and utilizing whatever that therapeutic happens to be. What I noticed by looking at the research is a pattern of negative reviews published in these medical journals. They usually disseminate the articles for free. In contrast to the pro-drug articles that they write, those are usually pay-per-view. The ones that are negative about nutrition are usually provided for free, and that's because they're trying to make their pharmaceutical advertisers happy. I also recently presented a video review on this article published by the American College of Cardiology. This was titled Supplemental Vitamins and Minerals for Cardiovascular Disease Prevention and Treatment. What I noted here in my previous review is the problematic bias of the journal, the problematic bias of the editors, the problematic bias of the authors who were funded by the drug and processed food industry, also unscientific exclusion of data, specifically the failure to include non-English research, which has no scientific basis. And when a study is funded by several multi-million-dollar companies, you can be very sure that they have the resources to translate that research if they want to look at it and if they want to include it. So their exclusion of what they called non-English research had no scientific basis, and they were obviously trying to avoid information that they did not want to include in their meta-analysis. To make that situation even worse, they specifically extracted the information they had previously reviewed that was favorable, showing that selenium actually provided benefit. So when they analyzed the data based on their own criteria for the meta-analysis, they looked at the studies on selenium, they found that the studies on selenium were favorable, and then they excluded those studies, and the only reason they gave is because the data was favorable. Problem number 6 that I noticed with this article was failure to maintain any clinical or pharmacologic standard, and you can see I've itemized quotes from that article so that you can see them here. And finally, the last problem that I pointed out is that they tried to analyze all this data together, and they really can't do that when they're looking at so many different treatments with so many different formulations and different dosages. They really can't put all that data together for a meta-analysis, but that's what they did, and that's what they published. And my position on that is, from being an expert in nutrition, is that that's just impossible to do. They cannot take all vitamins and minerals, lump them together, not appreciating the differences among different formulations and dosages, for example, and then say all vitamins do this or all vitamins don't do this. They really can't do that legitimately from a scientific, ethical, and intellectual standpoint based on the way that they collected the data and the way that they presented the data. And as I mentioned previously, all of these news outlets, including medical journals, television shows, newspapers, magazines, all of those media outlets take millions of dollars per year from the pharmaceutical industry. And as a result, they of course want to please their advertisers by presenting a consistent story that helps their advertisers make profit on their advertising dollar. And they try to present several different stories consistently, and those are, number 1, diseases are mysterious and we can't understand them. Number 2, we have to rely on drugs for our salvation. And number 3, nutrition either doesn't work or it's confusing and the data is conflicted. Those are the consistent stories published in mainstream medical journals, television, magazines, newspapers. Number 1, we don't understand disease. Number 2, we need drugs. Even though we don't understand disease, we still need drugs because somehow drugs solve the problems that we don't understand. And then the third story that gets headlined all the time is that nutrition is confusing. And I'm here to tell you several things, one of which is that nutrition is not confusing and it can be understood and applied clinically. So let's look at how we might apply nutrition in this topic of cardio nutrition. Again, we focus in on the same considerations that you'd focus in on if you were studying cardiology or cardiovascular physiology or pathology. You would look at diseases of the heart muscle itself, the myocardium. Coronary arteries, of course, are a major concern because if the blood supply gets blocked, the myocardium can't function. Electroconduction, systemic contributions and complications such as diabetes and insulin resistance, and then renal considerations. And I'll itemize a few of those here. So let's look at the myocardium. The heart is a muscle, and so it is therefore sensitive to nutritional insufficiencies such as vitamin D, magnesium, and potassium. The high metabolic demand should make you think of mitochondria, and you also, of course, have to think outside of the heart to include hormones such as thyroid and insulin, and afterload such as peripheral resistance. I'll talk more about those things in another video. With the coronary arteries, we're mostly concerned about atherosclerosis, also vasospasm, which can be induced by magnesium deficiency or food allergies. And I'll discuss this in another video. Electroconduction, we think about arrhythmias, AFib, and of course electrolytes. Systemic contributions and complications, hyperinsulinemia and hyperglycemia, of course, are very important. Lipid disorders, hormones such as insulin, cortisol, thyroid, testosterone, estrogen, etc., and also systemic resistance, endothelial dysfunction, of course, afterload. And we also have to think of hypertension-induced gut disorders and nutritional consequences of conditions such as congestive heart failure. For the kidneys, we of course want to think about those kidneys because they are potentially damaged by hypertension, and damaged kidneys also perpetuate cardiovascular disease. So kidneys are both the target of cardiovascular disease and, in some cases, a potential or leading cause of cardiovascular disease. So for that reason, we have to talk about the kidneys anytime we talk about cardiovascular health. So again here, the main topics in cardio nutrition are listed here, 1 through 6. So let's talk about some topics that touch on all of those, and of course, that's diet. So the most popular diet today is arguably the low-carb paleo diet or a ketogenic diet. The most obvious nutritional imbalances and deficiencies caused by a typical example of this diet are deficiencies of fiber and phytochemicals, everything from polyphenols to folates, and this is due, of course, to the low intake of fruits and vegetables. With that, we also see a reduced intake of potassium and a reduced intake of citrate, and I know that a lot of people don't think about citrate as being a nutrient, but of course it is. A lot of times when we think about nutrition, we think of macronutrients such as fats, carbohydrates, protein, which of course gets broken down into its amino acids. We think of vitamins, we think of minerals, but a lot of times we don't think of phytochemicals, polyphenols, and organic acids such as citrate. So on the following slide, I'm going to introduce what I call action topic number 1. So we've already talked about the importance of overpowering this systematic ignorance that pervades cardiology, and for that matter pervades nutrition education throughout medical school, and for that matter pervades all of society, because certainly most of society doesn't understand basic nutrition, let alone advanced interventional functional nutrition. So for this reason, I'm going to try to focus in on what I call here an action topic, which I'm about to introduce, and then I'll throw in a few key ways to understand nutrition toward the end of this video. So the situation is this: low carbohydrate paleo or ketogenic diet is the most popular diet today, and for good reason. It's the best diet solution to the epidemics of obesity and diabetes. A potential problem that we see with low carbohydrate ketogenic diets is that they are commonly higher in protein, and that's generally fine, but we're going to talk about an important exception in just a moment. But they are notoriously deficient in potassium and citrate, along with some other nutrients that I mentioned previously, like phytochemicals and fiber. And adding sodium chloride on top of a ketogenic diet can certainly make things worse. So when we talk about dietary protein, for example, I'm certainly in favor of a robust quantity of protein in the diet. However, dietary protein, especially from animal sources, is the major source of sulfur-containing amino acids, which are partly converted into sulfuric acid, which is an acid that has to be either excreted with some effort by the kidneys. So excretion of protons or hydrogen ions is not a free service. You pay for that, and the way that you pay for that is through extra work performed by the kidneys. So a high protein diet, for example, does make the kidneys work a little harder. Let's just accept that for what it is. So those animal-based proteins have more sulfur-containing amino acids. Some of that sulfur gets converted into sulfuric acid. That acid has to get either excreted or buffered, but when it's excreted by the kidneys, that forces the kidneys to work a little harder, and that of course has consequences in the long term. If it's not excreted, then of course those acids can be buffered, but they have to be buffered by mechanisms which of course come with a price as well. One of those mechanisms is to use bicarbonate, and the body creates bicarbonate from citric acid. So when we talk about fruits and vegetables being a source of citric acid, the relevance of that, the physiologic relevance of that, isn't simply for mineral absorption, because of course citric acid helps in that regard, but citric acid is also what the body uses to directly produce bicarbonate, and the body uses bicarbonate to neutralize these acids. So again, physiologically produced acids either have to be excreted with some effort by the kidneys, or they have to be buffered. And one of the main mechanisms for buffering acid is the conversion of citrate into bicarbonate. Well, if the diet is inadequate in its intake of fruits and vegetables, it's probably going to be inadequate in its intake of citric acid. And so the body's not going to have the precursor that it desires for producing bicarbonate to neutralize and buffer these acids. If the diet happens to be higher in salt, that sodium also increases excretion of calcium, promoting osteoporosis and kidney stones. Sodium, we now know, also promotes inflammation, and it also promotes tissue hypoxia. The chloride anion, that's the other side, let's say, or the other part of sodium chloride. The chloride part is also acidogenic, so it increases the body's acidic load as well. To balance some of these effects, we have potassium. Most people don't consume enough potassium. The recommended intake for potassium for teens and adults is 4.7 grams per day. Typical intake in the United States is deficient, either by 25 or up to 50% of that. Citrate also functions to enhance mineral absorption, create bicarbonate, and thereby buffer acid and protect the bones and kidneys, and protect against the formation of urate and calcium kidney stones. As I just mentioned, the recommended intake for potassium is 4.7 grams of potassium per day for teens and adults. Typical potassium intake is deficient by 1 to 2 grams, that is 25 to 50%, and that insufficiency is exacerbated by dietary sodium, especially sodium chloride, also psychoemotional stress, and some drugs. And we have to be a little careful sometimes with potassium, especially in patients who have renal insufficiency or patients, for example, who are taking potassium-sparing diuretics, such as spironolactone. Those can cause elevated blood levels of potassium, and of course that can be dangerous. But if the patient is not taking a potassium-retaining drug and the kidneys are functioning fine, then the patient shouldn't have any problem with this recommended intake of 4.7 grams per day of potassium. On the following page, I provide another table, this time from another source, also showing the recommended intakes per age for potassium per day. So you can see for infants up to 6 months, 400 milligrams, up to 12 months, 700 milligrams. And then at 1 to 3 years, they can tolerate 3,000 milligrams, a little bit more from 4 to 8 years. And then once kids start getting into their teen years, they can tolerate an adult dose. From 9 to 13 years, 4,500 milligrams. And then from 14 years on, into adulthood, 4,700 milligrams per day. That's 4.7 grams per day. We notice that the dose is the same for pregnant women, but the dose increases for women who are lactating up to 5,100 milligrams per day, or 5.1 grams per day. Potassium citrate is naturally found in fruits and vegetables. However, most people's intake is either inadequate or, at best, inconsistent. Potassium citrate is also available as a powder supplement, non-caloric powder supplement that can be mixed in water or any other beverage. The advantage, of course, to a powder supplement is that it provides stability and portability, which is good when people have to go to work or when they're traveling. Nearly everybody, as I've already said, needs more potassium, and certainly most people can benefit from more citrate as well. So the nice thing about citrate is that your body uses citrate to enhance the absorption of minerals. It also helps to dilute or bind certain substances in the urine to prevent the formation of kidney stones. And also, as I've already said, the body can use citrate to create bicarbonate and therefore buffer the effects of either excess sodium chloride or excess protein, and thereby protect the bones and kidneys and other structures and physiologic processes. As I stated at the start, the ketogenic diet, which is very popular these days, increases the need for both potassium and citrate. The incidence of renal stones in children on a ketogenic diet is 6.7%, which is approximately 1 per 15 patients, or in this case, 1 per 15 kids. The empiric use of potassium citrate reduces the incidence of kidney stones to less than 1%. And on the following page, I'm going to present to you a table that I just finished creating yesterday. And what this does in the sections that are highlighted is it shows you the doses that are used in clinical studies using potassium citrate specifically, so that you get a feel for what's being done in the research literature and therefore some idea of what you can do clinically. When we talk about dosing potassium, I think most of us are more comfortable using grams and milligrams than we are with using millimoles and milliequivalents. So what I've done in this table is convert millimoles to milliequivalents and ultimately into milligrams so that we can all work with a unit of measure that we're comfortable with. Again, in this case, I'm prioritizing milligrams. So again, in summary, 1 millimole equals 1 milliequivalent, and each of those is equal to 39.1 milligrams of potassium. So again, this is a quick introduction into the upcoming topic of cardio nutrition. Again, medical physicians are typically undertrained in nutrition. Medical journals and organizations are paid by drug companies in various ways, and they have an inherent bias toward promoting drugs. And these drug companies pay medical journals and medical organizations through advertisements, research and education, quote-unquote donations, direct payments to editors, purchases of reprints, either pro-drug or anti-nutrition. These medical journals and organizations also promote ignorance and confusion in nutrition by publishing utterly retarded editorials and review articles on nutrition that would never pass minimal competence in a graduate nutrition course. Two recent examples are the article Associations of Omega-3 Fatty Acid Supplement Use with Cardiovascular Disease Risk. This was published in JAMA Cardiology, and I have already reviewed that article in video format with a PDF transcript also available. And number two here for another example, Supplemental Vitamins and Minerals for Cardiovascular Disease Prevention and Treatment. This was recently published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, and likewise I critiqued that in video and transcript format. The action topic for today is that of the low-carb paleo or ketogenic diet, which I think is great for many reasons, but it's inherently deficient in both potassium and citrate. The empiric use of potassium citrate reduces kidney stone incidence with the use of the ketogenic diet. This was published in Pediatrics 2009, July. In the next video, I'll get into more detail, and I'll talk about risks, implementation, and optimization of potassium citrate intake, and I'll focus a bit more on pH and magnesium intake, because we all need to appreciate the importance of urine pH and the relationships between urine pH, magnesium, and potassium. So thank you very much for your attention. This is Introduction to Cardio Nutrition. I'm calling this number 1 in that series, and I touched briefly on kidney stones and the ketogenic diet. I'll get into more detail in the upcoming video. I needed to clear a few topics out of the way so that we can focus more on therapeutics in the next video. And again, I appreciate your attention and look forward to presenting that new information to you in the next video.